As one of the more interesting parts of your activity in this mini-course on the writing of goals and objectives, in a moment I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sam Postlethwait of Purdue University. This mini-course series is based on the model established by Dr. Postlethwait for biology students. However, the approach has been adopted by almost every subject discipline, and it's spread throughout the world. As you probably know, Professor Postlethwait is well acquainted with the use of objectives. Objectives provide one of the foundation stones for the mini-course model, which he's developed for use in his audio tutorial approach to biology. Dr. Postlethwait, since you've been publicly associated with the formal use of objectives for so many years, certainly since the introduction of the AT approach around 1961, you can certainly be regarded as an expert in the use of objectives. So in your opinion, what are the major reasons that instructors have when they decide to use performance or behavioral objectives?
Well, Al, of course, you have been developing a lot of instructional materials yourself, and you know how important behavioral objectives are for structuring good programs and programs of learning. But the primary reason, well, really two things. One is for the student, and the second one would be for the teacher. Now, for the student, it's a matter of trying to enable the student to know what is expected of him, so that the student can work together, cooperate with you, the teacher, to achieve the appropriate goals. And the student needs to know what these goals are. The student doesn't really have any reason to know these goals until somebody communicates them to them. That's why they come to a university, because there at the university are people who know what botany ought to be, and then they can communicate this to students, and students then can move toward this. Secondly, with the teacher, a teacher needs to know precisely what he expects of a student. Many teachers teach with some vague ideas in their own mind as to what they would like their student to achieve. But when you begin to write these and put them down on paper so that you know precisely what you expect, then you can give more assistance. Now, sometimes I think of objectives a little bit like the students who are just inundated with subject matter, and they have to sort out that which is of consequence to them. And I think of the analogy of somebody who can't swim being thrown into a body of water, and they expend a tremendous amount of energy, and they flounder around and splash water all over. But if that same amount of energy could be directed to the activities of swimming in a specific kind of way, they will achieve. And so it's just a matter of the difference, not a matter of difference in expenditure of energy, but a matter of the difference in doing it with some knowledge of how to accomplish the end product.
What do you think these objectives then ought to be shared with the students?
Indeed, that would be the primary purpose of writing objectives, would be to share them with the students so that the students would know and could work together with you to achieve certain specific goals. Now, it's not that it doesn't help the teacher. Indeed, the teacher can look at the student's performance and then go back and modify his instructional program to assist the student there. But the primary purpose must be, well, the primary purpose of the whole activity of education must be to help students learn. And if that is really true, then we need to develop guidelines for each of us, both students and the teacher.
How closely do you think the test items ought to relate to the objectives? Because you know sometimes there's a criticism that if the objective and the test item are worded the same, then the instructor is teaching to the test.
Well, I think this has probably been one of my greatest difficulties, because most of us have been conditioned over the years that the reason for an educational system is to eliminate certain students rather than to help students learn. Now, I know that some people would not agree with me, but I do believe that we set up quotas for failure and focus on that instead of helping students achieve. Now, one of the things then that we must do if we write objectives is to give credit if students achieve these objectives. And I'll never forget the young lady who came to my office one time and she saw this sign that said objectives, and she said, "What's this?" And I said, "The objectives." And she pulled out one of the sheets and she looked at it and she said, "Well, you don't let the students see this, do you?" And I said, "Why, sure." She said, "My goodness, they'll learn it all." Now, you see, if they learned it all, then you would be forced to give them a reasonable grade. And most of us are not conditioned this way. And so even if we write objectives, there's a real tendency on the part of most of us who teach to write questions that will sort them out and eliminate a certain percentage.
I guess if you can keep them off balance just a little while they try to psych you out, most students, I think, do figure the first couple of tests are going to be the psyching out time. Then they can start performing.
And so then you see, there's another problem then we have, is that students conditioned to that kind of approach to education have difficulty in making the transition to where you're now saying, here is what I expect you to learn. Let's work together for you to arrive there, and then I'll give you credit. There's a credibility gap here, and you reinforce that credibility gap if you say, these are the objectives, the student achieves these, and you test him over something else.
Maybe it's the last question. Do you think then that instruction ought to be limited to the objectives? If you said this is what we're going to cover, then that's it.
Well, in my experience, no way has the instruction been limited to the objectives. And it would only be this if the teacher set out to do that and that only. And I find the students exposed to quantities of subject matter learn lots of things that are not listed in the objectives. Now, our objectives then ought to represent a minimal amount of achievement that we will accept as mastery of that particular subject. And so the other information that we make available to our students, because they are human beings and curious, they will go ahead and learn additional things. And my experience has taught me that this is literally so. There has been some research in Berkeley, for example, that has indicated that given an instructional program, it's possible to write a number of different kinds of objectives, which seems to be a bit contrary to the way most of us talk about writing objectives. But it is literally so that an instructional program is perceived by different students from different perspectives and with different backgrounds, and so they will accumulate different kinds of information. So all we're talking about then is the minimum achievement level that we will accept.
Thank you, Sam. Would you like to make any final comment to the participants in the workshop about your feeling on the value of objectives and reasons for using them?
Well, I'd just like to say that I have used objectives now for a great many years, and the first major advance in helping my students learn was when I began to provide them with objectives. The instructional strategies are of some value, this is true, but they are really of little consequence if one can know where you expect to arrive and then provide instructional systems, not a instructional system, but a great variety of pathways for them to arrive at this particular point. Having done this, I've seen the results of this. Statistically, I suppose it could very well be supported, but I don't think that it needs to be supported statistically. If I want to take a trip across the country, first thing I do is get a map and I have my goals identified. I'm much more likely to arrive there if I know where I'm going than if I don't. I don't have to support that statistically.
Thank you, Sam. In a few minutes, we'll return to this tape to see what a little bird had to tell Sam about how to write an objective. Sam, I've heard you say that most teachers have objectives, at least to some degree. So this doesn't qualify objectives to be anything unusual or different then?
Oh no, it's an old idea, and as long as we've had teachers, they had something in mind that they were trying to accomplish, and so objectives didn't start as something recent. It's been a long time that people have thought about what they want students to learn.
You're well known for your ability to clarify concepts by using examples from your own experience. So I'm sure that there must be something that's happened to you that you could share with us that would help describe just what you mean when you use the term behavioral objectives.
Well, maybe a little wren story will help. Not long ago, I was out in the woods, and there was a little wren that was Carolina wren that was just chattering away, and it was pretty clear to me that this wren had an objective in mind. Number one, he wanted me to depart. Number two, he wanted me to do it immediately. And number three, he wanted me to get clear out of his domain. Well, the success of his behavior, his activity, was pretty much dependent on whether or not I departed, and whether or not I did it quickly, and whether or not I got clear out of his area here. So I think that a lot of us who are teachers are somewhat like this. We have a lot of activities that we go through, but it's not necessarily true that the invader, me, the learner, perceives precisely what the other person had in mind. I guess Megger has helped us identify some of the things that ought to go into an objective. And he suggests here, and I'll just read what he says here. He says that we should identify a specific terminal behavior of the learner, define the desired objective or behavior by describing the important condition under which a behavior will be expected to occur, and then specify how well the learner must perform for his effort to be considered acceptable. Now, I think that Megger has delineated for us some really important components of good objectives. That's not to say that there aren't other kinds of objectives, but these are excellent.
Well, then what is the main difference in what Megger has said and what most of us do?
Well, most of us do know what we would like our students to learn. But you take the wren as another case in point. All this chattering here, if it didn't communicate to me, and he did communicate to me, I had a good idea what he had in mind. But there might have been other ways, other than all this noise, to have gotten me to behave like he wanted me to behave. For example, I've seen quail that they act as if they were hurt, and they lead you from the area. There is some question, I guess, about whether he needed to do anything. I might have reached that objective if he'd just been quiet. I would have gone ahead and gotten out of the territory. But there's also another point here. I thought I owned that area, and I know that I had to share this necessarily with the Wren. And so he might have been asking something of me that he had no right to ask. And so I think that it's important then for us to get our objectives out and written so that we can attack them and see if they are right and fair. In fact, just yesterday, I had 9 of my students go over the entire set of objectives that I have for my course, and they were going over these with this in mind, asking first whether or not they really communicated so that they could understand what I had in mind, and then secondly, whether this was fair, whether this was something that I had a right to ask of them. So I think that this puts teaching in a different context than what we normally have done, and puts it out to where we can now analyze those things which we're doing and seeing whether these are of value.
So I take it then in objectives you wouldn't use terms like understand and know and these fuzzies.
Well, of course, those kinds of words will not convey specifically enough to the student to know when they have achieved. And so while I don't go in for specific wording of objectives very much, still the person who reads the objective must be able to know whether or not they have achieved by reading the objective and comparing that with what they are able to now to do.
They've got to be able to interpret what you mean.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Sam. That gives us a useful overview of what Mager has to say, and also we've enjoyed discussing with you your feelings about objectives as well as what should go into them, and especially thank you for the illustration. Are there any other comments that you'd like to make to the viewers before we close off this exploration into objectives?
Well, thank you, Al. I'm real pleased to have had an opportunity to be with you. I think that the writing of objectives will have a major impact on the way any teacher teaches. It's not the only thing that makes you teach well. And again, people may have objectives that are not written, and they're perfectly valid. The student can find these out in some sort of way, maybe from other students or from other sources, such as looking at old tests. But it seems to me that a logical thing would be just forthrightly trying to allow the student to know what you expect and then help him achieve this.
This brief video presentation is part of your activity in MiniCourse number 1 of the In-Service Faculty Development Workshop Series. I'm Al Mizell, developer of this series, and I'd like to introduce you to some comments made by Dr. K. Patricia Cross, who's well known for her concern with the need to improve today's instructional practices. Although the improvement of teaching is a worthy goal for all educators, it's particularly important if we hope to meet the educational needs of the large number of new students that Dr. Cross has described so well. In a paper presented at Concurrent General Session 1 of the 31st National Conference on Higher Education, sponsored by the American Association of Higher Education in Chicago, on March 8, 1976, Dr. Cross developed an interesting hypothetical analogy which exemplifies our usual view of what constitutes a successful teacher. The following visualizations of Dr. Cross's remarks vividly point out the absurdity of some of our commonly accepted approaches to the improvement of teaching?
While the current efforts to improve university teaching should be applauded, let's make it clear that such applause should be mild. It is hard to know what to do for more vigorous applause when the reality is that instructional improvement is dependent upon faculty cooperation. One common practice that I am certain we should not perpetuate is that of pretending that years of experience or even scholarly reputation are necessarily related to the quality of undergraduate instruction. As college professors are quick to point out in these days of enthusiasm for granting credit for experiential learning, experience alone does not constitute knowledge. Yet too many faculty workshops today attempt to legitimize themselves by opening the conference with an address by a respected campus scholar who knows a lot about his discipline, but very little about the learning process. After catching the spirit of a scholar addressing a workshop on instructional improvement, I drafted some remarks for an unlikely day when the educator might be invited to address a meeting of scientists on their specialty. The two scenarios go like this. First, the distinguished scholar addresses the faculty development workshop.
I have never had a course on teaching, and I know nothing about the various theories of learning. I have, however, taught in the university classroom for some 25 years. And while I'm not familiar with so-called teaching methods and techniques, my experience and observations will be helpful and useful to the rest of you. There is, of course, no real science of education in the sense that experts can predict with certainty who will succeed in college, nor do we know how to create the most desirable learning conditions. Therefore, it seems to me that I, who am in the classroom every day, can probably be as helpful in understanding learning as can researchers who never teach in the reality of the classroom. While I admit that there is a certain amount of technology and techniques that can probably be used to improve the performance of the average teacher, like instructional objectives and teacher evaluation perhaps, the master teacher is not dependent on tools and techniques. He has a sensitivity for learning, a feel for when real learning is taking place. A teacher who loves his subject and who personally experiences the joy of learning is probably in the best position to create such satisfactions for others.
Now, let us parallel this real-life story with the unlikely scenario in which a distinguished educator who knows a great deal about teaching and learning is invited to address a group of scientists. In this case, meteorologists who are eager to lend credibility to their work because of recent criticism of their weather predictions. In this fantasy, there is the familiar exploitation of the professor's distinction to the unrealistic hope that his personal experience with weather conditions will contribute important insights to their workshop on meteorology. His remarks might go like this.
I have never studied meteorology, and I know nothing of the various theories on the subject. I have, however, lived in the physical world for a good many years. While I have no idea what causes certain weather patterns or how to induce rain when we need it, I do put on snow tires in the winter and carry an umbrella when it rains. I hope my experience and observations will be helpful and useful to professional meteorologists. There is, of course, no real science of weather in the sense that experts can predict with certainty whether it will rain on a given day, nor do we know how to bring about the most desirable weather conditions. Therefore, it seems to me that I, who live with the weather every day, can probably be as helpful in understanding it as can researchers who rarely venture into the reality of a rainstorm or a blizzard. While I admit that there are some techniques that can probably be used to improve the performance of the average meteorologist, barometers and weather maps perhaps, The master meteorologist is not dependent on tools and techniques. He has a sensitivity to the weather and perhaps a good arthritic knee. A meteorologist who loves weather, who personally experiences the joy of beautiful days, is probably in the best position to create such satisfactions for others.
My analogy between the science of meteorology and the science of teaching was carefully chosen. Neither is an infallible science. Both are better at predicting than at creating desirable climates for growth. Nevertheless, the Weather Bureau has a significantly better understanding of climatic conditions than some farmers would like to admit. And educators and psychologists know a lot more about learning than some professors would like to admit. Another hurdle that must be cleared on the way to the improvement of instruction is the academic distrust of experimentation and innovation. It's hard to explain why college professors who are so curious and experimental in the pursuit of improvements and better answers within their own disciplines should be so conservative in the practice of their profession. I was talking with a college dean recently who stated emphatically that the first priority of colleges should be the improvement of traditional instruction, and only when that was perfected should colleges spend money to support innovation and experimentation. In the midst of being grateful for his support of the idea that traditional instruction should be improved, I asked myself where General Electric would be if they had decided to perfect the icebox before starting work on the refrigerator. Sure, I'm in favor of plugging the leaks and improving the insulation in the old iceboxes, but not at the expense of supporting the development of refrigerators. Happily, some people have started work on the instructional equivalent of refrigerators. I predict that consumers who have experienced even primitive versions of the refrigerator may come to demand it over some pretty high-quality ice boxes.
All of the previous remarks were adaptations of comments made by Dr. Cross through the assistance of 3 participants in the 1976-77 Teaching Improvement Program at Purdue University, directed by Dr. Samuel Postlethwait. I would like to thank Jerry Roberts, Ralph Burns, and Joe Brown for their interpretations which made these remarks by Dr. Cross so vivid for you.